This episode is sponsored by Kendo UI. Kendo UI allows you to build better apps faster. They have a comprehensive library ranging from data grids and charts to buttons and sliders. Plus, you can use their components as plain JavaScript as well as in Angular, React, and Vue. They have a large collection of customizable popular themes like Boot Strap and Material. Go check them out at javascriptjabber.com/KendoUI. Hey everybody, and welcome to another episode of Views on Vue. This week on our panel we have Fritz from the Vue core team.
Hi.
I'm Charles Max Wood, and I'm from, what am I working on these days? From my course, How to Get a Job course. Anyway, you can find it at getacoderjob.com. I'm also pulling off a Kickstarter for a new project you can check out at codebadge.org. And one last announcement, just because people have begged and begged and begged. If you go to swag.devchat.tv, you can get t-shirts and mugs and stuff. I don't think we make a lot of money from that, but I just set it up because people kept asking me. So anyway.
Finally.
Yeah, I know, right?
Can we get like a Views on Vue shirt too?
Yeah, I'm going to be putting that in over the next couple of days.
Nice.
And more weeks ahead. So by the time this goes out, folks, it's there. We've got a couple of guests. We've got Kyle Holmberg. Do you want to say hi, Kyle?
Howdy.
And then we have Alex Regan. Alex, do you want to say hi?
Hello.
Now, do you two want to introduce yourselves?
Hey, go ahead. So my name is Alex, and I got started with Vue just a couple of years ago on a company project, and I've only been developing for about 3 years, and kind of helped accelerate my progress. But I like doing some open source stuff and kind of new to the whole developer ecosystem.
Yeah, this is Kyle. I got into Vue because there was a guy that needed to do the project for Charter, and he didn't want to do it himself. So he was just like, go do it. And they told me to not use React. So I went with Vue, and I learned it thanks to Maximilian Schwartzmuller's Udemy course. Shout out. And thanks a lot to Alex for saving my hiney a lot of the time on some of the tougher aspects of the dashboard.
And this is our first time meeting in person, so nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
In person, in air quotes.
Sort of in person, yeah. I guess in real time?
In real time. I like that.
Yeah. I can practically pat him on the back.
You can see each other's faces. There we go. Yeah, I don't know if our listeners really know, but we switched to Zoom and there's video. I'm working on making sure that my co-hosts are all okay with sharing the video before I post it. But that's the thing that I want to do, so we'll see how that goes. I'm a little bit curious. Then, what has your relationship looked like over the last however long?
Are you talking about between Kyle and I?
Yeah.
I believe we got started because, he was mentioning his project. They kind of steered him in a direction that made Vue a choice that seemed easy, I guess. And he was looking for something that probably, Kyle, you can say more, but something that was easy to get up and running. And he was looking at using Boot Strap. And there's a library called Boot Strap Vue, which enables Boot Strap 4 with no jQuery dependency. And so it probably, that's like a nice choice. And I was contributing as a core team member at the time because I was using that for my company's project. And so I think he started just by like, hey, how do I get started with Bootstrap Vue? And I probably helped him enough to where he's like, hey, you want to also help me figure out some Vue things because I'm pretty new to this. So I think that's where it got started.
Yeah, essentially, at the time he was a core contributor, I dived into the Bootstrap Vue Slack team, which was really helpful. And I had gotten a lot of the basic things down, but essentially, like the inspiration for my article we'll eventually touch on essentially came from there was a tough aspect of like this really nested tree aspect in the dashboard. And we just kind of hashed it out over the course of a week, and we talked a lot. And now we shout each other out on Twitter, and then we're here.
Nice.
So you've both done some sort of open source work within the Vue ecosystem. Is that correct? Obviously with Bootstrap Vue, like how did you were using it for your company. Like how did you end up starting contributing? How did that work? What did that look like?
Right. So I was kind of in an open-ended project. I mean, the developer team is where I was working previously was only 3 people. So there's a lot of autonomy. So I, choose whatever you want to choose. And I chose that because I was most comfortable with Bootstrap at the time. And I think initially I found that I needed some more fine-grained hooks on modals or something like that. Like somebody dictated, hey, you need this like modal flow, and it involves modals, right? Where one closes and then you have to open another one, which is not anyone's preferred UX, but someone says and you try and figure it out. And so I was trying to get the hooks right so that the transitions, since the modal shows and it leaves, and you have to wait until the transitions are complete. There was kind of a bug there, and I don't think they had implemented any hooks yet that included the transitions. So I actually started with an issue, and then I was like, you know what, I might be able to figure this out. And I started diving in the source code and kind of figured out what I could do. And then from there, I was like, well, if you want the change, I can help out a little bit. And I don't even know if that change got accepted right away. But the more I started using it, the more I was like, you know what, I just want to make sure this thing works. I actually started contributing some test coverage for the library. And I think that was really where I got involved enough where the original, creator of the library was like, I think you could, be a core team member. And he kind of just took a chance on me, which was pretty cool. There was a lot of trust involved. And at that point, I think my contributing level went way up and started doing more actual library code. But I definitely started a lot with test coverage, which may not be the canonical path for getting started versus like documentation. But it seemed a good way for me to also understand how the library worked.
Yeah, it gives you a lot of opportunities to ask questions, just like writing documentation. And at that time, how long had you been developing?
Oh, a year and a half.
A year and a half. So
we got one early. I love it.
Yeah. A lot of people, when they've only been programming a few years, can get a little bit scared to contribute to open source and not be sure where to start. Like, would you have any tips for them, having actually been there relatively recently and managed to start contributing to projects and creating new projects?
Yeah, I mean, there's a little bit of like a thick skin kind of argument to be made. I guess I look at the internet as everyone's anonymous. And so sometimes people say things that are a little out of character that would just be maybe rude in person. And sometimes you find yourself being that person. And so to me, there's like a little bit of thick skin around that. And, everyone, I guess you could say I just trust in the fact that everyone is got the imposter syndrome. And I don't know if I really knew that up front, but I was sort of shameless to start. And I figured that if you just put something out there, somebody's going to correct you. And like I said, if you've got a little bit of that thick skin, then you can figure out like how to improve on that rather than, you'll actually get the answer to your question. I think people have talked about before, if you want to learn if you're right or wrong about something, just post it on the internet and you'll find out all opposing viewpoints. So, if you put yourself out there, it's kind of like failure driven development, right? You find that something didn't work and then you're able to iterate on it, right? And it's the same way with open source. You just put something out there and you'll get feedback, and that feedback loop ends up tightening a lot.
Yeah. And text communication, where like a lot of development communication happens, like in issues and chat and things like that, there's also so much context that's lost. So something that, in person would sound like very nice and patient, when you just see the text might seem, impatient or even angry.
Absolutely. I know I have a tendency towards sarcasm. So, I have learned that it's best to save that for last, if at all. And you have to understand that there's a lot of people that come from other languages. And I don't mean programming languages. I mean, spoken languages. And a lot of times people are making a severe effort to write an issue in English. And, it comes out any number of ways. And you have no idea what the real intent is because, it's not their first language.
Yeah, the internet is a very international community. I definitely recommend staying away from sarcasm. I think you're right.
In terms of open source for new developers, like I actually work, I do a lot of open source development. Nothing, I think in terms of Vue, I contributed like 2 PRs to Boot Strap Vue. However, I do a lot of open source development on not necessarily libraries, but websites. I'm a Latino and I work with La Taqueria, which is like a Latin-based tech org, and they have their open source. They've open sourced their website so people can contribute to it. I plan on diving in there. And then there's also a nonprofit that I work with. And I think that's one cool thing is for people who are that are new developers getting into open source development. I think there's definitely like a paradigm shift between working on a library that's open source, which I think is more complex because you have to worry about everybody's use cases, as opposed to working on maybe like a website or like a simple product. I think that's one of the best ways, in my opinion, to get started with contributions. And with Operation Code especially, we actually gear the repository for newcomers. So extra documentation, maybe less complex syntactic sugar, stuff like that.
Yeah, that's a good point about the difference between application code and library code. And actually, like, building a library that you share with people can be a great way to sort of speed up, accelerate your learning, because it's kind of like building 100 apps instead of just that one app. Because everyone, like, all of their most difficult problems, they come to you and ask you, like, what's going on here? And you're exposed to so many more things than you would be in your own application. Have you found that that's true for you?
I know I've found that that's definitely true. And one thing that I guess, if you're the kind of person that has a lot of skin in your projects, like I take a lot of pride in what I do. You know, I don't get offended if someone says something like, you know, they don't like it, or they don't, you know, there's something they find that could be done better. But I think if you have that kind of mentality, you can have a tendency to want to acquiesce to every person's request for your library. And so if you're that type of personality, it's also really good to like find some way to like test every request against like a core tenant or so. So that you can go, okay, is this actually my concern, or is this, you know, is it a documentation issue, or is it like, you know, you gotta figure out where the boundaries are between your library. And if you're just starting out, that's kind of tough, and you're gonna make mistakes, and that's fine.
So coming up with some core values can help you make those decisions. So you're not tempted to always just like go with every single feature that anyone suggests.
Absolutely, yeah. Basically, it's you know, coming up with good interface boundaries for your library.
Well, it's interesting because those core values are things that serve in just about any project I've worked on. Once we figured out what we really cared about when it came to the project, it made it a whole lot easier to say yes to the right things and no to the wrong things.
And then one tech tip is there's a tool called Standard Version that I got introduced to on the Boot Strap Vue project. And if you use what's called conventional commits, it's just a sort of like organizational way to write your commit messages, where you use sort of a specific syntax. It can automate a lot of your semantic versioning. And so as you go through and you make changes and you know, maybe deal with some feature requests, some bugs and whatnot, you can also help all of your library consumers by using a tool like that and saving yourself a lot of trouble in terms of like actually declaring versions that their projects and, you know, NPM can understand.
Great tip.
Yeah.
And so Kyle, what did your getting into open source look like or feel like? It sounds like Alex might have roped you in for some PRs.
Yeah, in terms of contributing to Boot Strap Vue, I mean, essentially it was like business requirements. You know, they wanted Bootstrap, and I looked for, as working with modern frameworks does, you just kind of look for the better wrapper, and Bootstrap Vue seemed like the clear and obvious winner. And as I was working, I believe my two contributions were one related to like the well component that they had, and then my first issue was documenting, changing documentation. There was some slippy thing regarding like importing the actual CSS to the client, the original file. But in terms of contribution, I think the documentation came, what's the word? It came kind of like unrequested. In terms of the well, that kind of came as a result of working with Alex. And so he definitely wrote me in there. In terms of like general open source development, Operation Code posted on some subreddit, some programming subreddit. And one thing led to another, and they basically like recreated the website with like this junior developer at the helm. And so I don't know if it's the best code base, but it was a very lucky and unique way to get involved. And I definitely think there are many opportunities like that out there in terms of bouncing off of Alex's recommendation. At some point, you just got to dive in. And I think there's so many maintainers that are so helpful that'll give you like a lot of trust and hold your hand through the process. So, and that's normal and that's fine. And over time, you'll get the courage and the ability and the contextual knowledge to be able to contribute yourself.
You keep mentioning Operation Code, and the organization has gotten a bit of exposure on various shows, and I just want to shout out about it because I really love the organization. Nell Shamrell's been on the Ruby Rogues a couple of times, and she's the CTO over there. I know Aimee Knight's also been involved, and she's one of our panelists on JavaScript Jabber. And just the idea of serving people who are coming back from serving their country, just it really appeals to me. So I just want to say nice things there and just recognize the effort that goes in. I'm not sure that anybody gets paid really to work on it, and you're out there helping people who have sacrificed for other people, and that's awesome.
I appreciate that. Yeah, no, they definitely deserve all the effort we get. It is entirely volunteer based. Nobody gets paid.
Anyway, you were saying, Chris?
I think I was asking Kyle how he started asking questions and what kinds of questions he asked. Like, how did you get people to help you?
Yeah, sure. So
how did you decide what to put in an issue, like versus Stack Overflow or something like that?
Oh, okay. I actually tend, if it's a complex like application or language specific issue, I tend to go to Stack Overflow. If it's definitely related to like a library or a framework, then I trend towards GitHub. That just seems to be the way I go. I also like to not do either in terms of kind of like that text-based communication paradigm we were talking about earlier. I find that real-time text is at least the best way you can go in that aspect. So I always, like, I have, 20 Slack teams, like, at least. And so, like, I always trend towards, like, hey, do they have a Discord or a Slack team? Because then I can just ask them real-time, slide in the DMs or whatever. In terms of, like, why or how I got into it, for Boot Strap Vue, rather, I essentially just kind of dive in based off the documentation, and I ran into a snag. And for that original documentation PR, I was able to resolve it on my own. I realized what the issue was, and immediately I made a PR for the documentation to kind of cite the issue that I was talking about. And in terms of the well, after working on that dashboard issue, essentially, and this is kind of the more often thing that you'll see where maintainers are so helpful. I think that Alex essentially was just like, hey, you know what? Like, this would be really good if we just put this in this component, because I think it can be like abstracted out to apply for like many reasons. And I believe it was related to using like a scope slot as opposed to just rendering like data as a child, if I'm not mistaken. But so that was essentially like what we got into there. It was just, we found a use case for it, and he just kind of nudged me to contribute. And so it wasn't even asking a question. And sometimes you just find use cases as you develop more and more. You find something that doesn't quite fit what you're doing. And maybe you think to yourself, hey, like, there's many other people that are going to need to use this. And then you ask a core contributor about the issue. And so like this weekend, I just contributed to Next.js, which is like the React equivalent of Nuxt. And basically I was just like, hey, like custom mirror pages aren't working on static exports. And I brought that up just like that. And I Googled it, and I found a spectrum.chat thread on it. And so I posted the thread, and then some maintainer went so above and beyond in their Slack team. His name's Tim. He was just like, here's the issue. Here's the exact code you need to change on this line. Like, it's just like, it made it so easy for me. And there's so many maintainers that'll do that.
So this is a question for either of you. I mean, as people who have asked questions and, on forums and chat and issues and things like that, and also answered them, do you have any suggestions for, first, maybe what not to do when like asking a question, when seeking help from other people?
Try and stay away from one sentence issues. Generally, when you write one sentence, you've left out so much context that there is bound to be a number of follow-ups. So if you can, like rather than kind of thinking the negative here, on the positive side, if you can provide a good amount of context, and sometimes issue templates almost go to the extreme with this, where they're a little bit inhibiting. You don't need to give me your whole app or anything like that, but reasonable amount of context for any issue or any question can go a long way. And don't be ashamed to put code samples and whatnot. And if you do want to put a giant code sample in, I highly recommend Googling the details component for the markdown in GitHub, because then you can toggle it and hide it. People can actually see the conversation. But that's just, an extra tip. But context.
So an issue that just says like, I got an error, please fix it.
Yep.
That happens so often.
Maybe that needs a little bit more context. Like, what other information would you provide?
Yeah, I mean, tell me what you were. So there's also like, so you want to say like, what was I doing? What was I calling? What was I trying? But there's a bigger overarching piece, which is what were you trying to do, right? And so there's a lot of.
And what were you expecting to see?
Exactly. Yeah. There's generally two problems that people have. They have the problem that they can see right in front of them, but they have the problem of the thing that they're trying to solve, and those are rarely like close. They're usually a little bit apart, and especially when you're coming from a text-based communication perspective, you don't have any of that extra context to see how they tie together.
Yeah. So if you don't provide enough context and you say like, well, I changed this and then it broke, and someone else might just respond like, well, then don't change it. Like it's that way for a reason.
Yeah, I think.
But if you provide a little bit more context, But if you provide a little bit more context about what you were trying to do, they might give a more helpful answer and say like, oh, okay, here's actually the right way to do that thing.
Yeah, I bet you if somebody used some sort of, machine learning tool or something, they could look and they could see that issues created, the number of words in the issue versus the number of words in the response, there's probably a correlation that the more you explain, there's actually more that, a maintainer is willing to respond with.
Well, the other thing is if it's one thing if it just totally breaks and barfs and throws an error. It's another thing if it does something different from what you expect. And what's interesting is that generally that nuance is something that can be corrected not just in the, okay, here, let's reset your expectations, but also can be corrected in the sense of, hey, we're going to go update the documentation to handle the nuance so that you don't think it does something it doesn't do.
Yeah, those are really great moments. Like I was, I just loved it when Kyle saw, a documentation issue, and, it could be one of those like quirks with importing Sass or something like that in a Webpack environment, right? And you need a tilde or something before a path. And it's like, it seems kind of obscure. And to some people who use it all the time, it's like, oh, I didn't even realize I do that. I'm in this environment a lot and it works for me. And so when people take those moments right away and they're just in the context of what, like this whole, like the Webpack plus the Sass plus the Boot Strap Vue, right? That little snowflake, that fingerprint of your problem can be great opportunities to add like these little documentation caveats.
Yep.
And documentations are really I cannot stress enough about. Everybody always says documentation is a great way to start contributing. We talked about many people speaking different languages, and you just got to keep in mind people are probably copy pasting a lot of things to Google Translate. And so if you have a typo, especially on an important word, that can just completely ruin somebody's experience with the library framework. So if you find a typo, definitely make a PR to fix it immediately, and that's huge.
Yeah, that's a great point. It might not mean a lot to people who are native English speakers if you're writing your docs in English, but for someone else, that could be the difference between understanding the point of this page and not.
Yeah, exactly.
So now we've talked about a little bit about what not to do and a little bit about what to do when writing a question. You want to provide lots of context. Are there any other tips that you would recommend to people beyond context? Can you have too much information?
You definitely have too much information. I'm guilty of sometimes putting... this is why my pro tip would be if you're, it's kind of biased for native English speakers, but if you have the ability to converse, I think hashing things out in a real-time conversation via some organizations' direct messages, if possible, would be my route to go, because maybe maybe your problem is documented somewhere, but documented poorly. So instead of like trying to fix code on your own or making an issue about where to fix the code, it could just be like, oh, like we've got that. You've just got to follow this documentation. Sorry, it wasn't clear. And then instead of your PR being like code, it could just be, going back to documentation. So the pro tip is essentially being like, go to real-time conversation if you can to hash things out before making issues, because especially on popular libraries, it's tough for maintainers to like keep track of all the issues. Like, how many libraries have you seen, like Babel, for instance, with like hundreds of open issues or PRs? And it's really tough to maintain. So if you can simplify somebody's life by figuring out the issue and really isolating what you need to contribute to resolve that so nobody else deals with it, that would be one tip that I had. And in terms of providing too much context, like that goes hand in hand. Like, if you can converse with somebody, you can rule out things that you don't need to provide them. At the same time, you're taking up that individual's time as opposed to just putting it on an issue for anybody to discuss. So take that advice with a grain of salt.
Yeah, I think kind of to Kyle's point, if you do a little bit of homework searching for the different kinds of communication avenues that a library has, there's often a Stack Overflow, hashtag or channel or however it works, where they try and like steer questions versus issues. These days, it's super common to see Discord or Slack for, like I was saying, real-time communication. In a lot of ways, GitHub issues can almost be a last resort or should almost be considered more specifically for, I have a bug that I think I'm experiencing. But there, like Kyle also mentioned, you're kind of dealing between async and, real-time communication, where, you're posting to a GitHub issue or to a Stack Overflow and, you kind of got to wait for a response back. But you're also not taking up the person's time. And I don't mind when somebody over provides information in those contexts versus maybe a real-time context where we could just sort of ask questions and drill down, So, like a maintainer might have a little more nuanced perspective to just say, okay, just, let me sort of guide you down this tree of my problem solving to help figure this out. But, I may not, have the same opinion that all maintainers do, but I personally prefer more context, go ahead and give me too much and then I'll help you rein it back, rather than not enough.
Alex, my database password is password 123.
Well, there are some things.
I'm being funny, but yeah, I agree. I mean, especially if people can share code, right? So if they can duplicate, like if you have this built into some module or some class or something in your application, and you can pull that out and add it to something else and give me code that I can actually duplicate it on, that's really helpful.
Yeah, some places, I don't know if they mandate, but they definitely suggest, a recreation like a JS Fiddle. And these days there's a lot of really cool tools out there like Code Sandbox and Stack Blitz, where you recreate the whole environment and share a link to some, URL that we can all trust, right? Sometimes I've seen people post URLs and I'm like, I apologize if this sounds rude, but I'm not clicking that. But when it's a Code Sandbox or a JS Fiddle, it's like, this is great. I can look at your isolated problem and see what may or may not be working. And I think Kyle may have actually used JS Fiddle to exchange certain, it's kind of like trying to architect his, he had this recursive accordion thing and little pieces of it may or may not have been working. And we were able to almost communicate a lot through there. Cause I think he did have some, sensitive, like company data that he was trying not to expose while still like making the problem generic to say, here's, a recreation of what I'm working with.
Yeah, we worked a lot in JS Fiddle in that week.
So when putting together an example that demonstrates the problem, that reproduces the issue, what are your tips for creating that piece of code? Like, is there a way to do it wrong?
Is your job search stuck? Maybe you're not getting any interviews with employers. Or maybe you are, but no job offers. Or you may be new and not even know where to start. This is Charles Max Wood, and I'm releasing a new course and ebook on how to find a job as a software developer. The course walks you through the process of finding the types of companies you want to work for, getting their attention, and putting your best foot forward as the candidate they want. I've coached dozens of developers in looking for jobs and have been able to help several people find jobs within 2 weeks to 2 months. So whether you're new to development, can't find a great job that fits what you want, or are looking for remote work from an area without a strong tech community, I can help. Go to getacoderjob.com and sign up today.
Yeah, that's actually one of the tougher things, I think, in open source. That does require like a touch of experience and stuff. I'd say that's definitely like a point where you want to do your best to try to get help from others if you're not used to it. Because the challenge here, like Alex mentioned, I can't just share my repository because it's private, and that's what the clients wanted. So I was forced to try to obfuscate an example. So one thing that you can use, like maybe you don't want to recreate an entire database. So like I use like JSON generator, for instance, that website to make up fake data. And then like I'll throw it into Firebase and just make it public read and just try to scrape something together. At the end of the day, creating an example for somebody, you just need to, the difficult aspect of it is making the right obfuscation so they see the problem. And also you can connect it back to your specific problem set. And so that goes into what Alex was saying, is just definitely provide context, because if I tell you my problem, the code problem, and give you an example, the chances of your issue getting resolved and getting resolved fast are supremely high.
If your application is open source, should you just share that?
100%.
Yeah, when you can have a whole reproduction repo, I mean, that's amazing. Someone was able to do that with me not too long ago. And the difference that makes for me is I'm able to just pop that into my editor with all my tools. And like, that is it's my environment, right? I'm trained to see the red squigglies from, ESLint or something like that, or the TypeScript language server. And so I'm able to spot things that, the machine helped me find, rather than things that I have to read through. Like, I guess one small tip is, when you provide code samples in GitHub issues, use the triple backticks with a language identifier, because having the syntax highlighting makes a huge difference for being able to spot a problem. Like, the moment I drop a code sample into my editor, which is usually how I, go, okay, let me see if I can look at what they're working on. And the syntax highlighting is broken. I'm like, oh, well, like, this isn't even a full and complete example, because, maybe it's missing some braces or something, which may actually be their problem, and it may not be their problem, right? It may have been just a bad copy paste. So, I mean, I kind of find that like the further you go out into this, like, recreate a problem, for someone to share with, right? There's a really high payoff, because, everyone can consume this in whatever, medium works best for them, and they can really get something working. But, the big difference is it's kind of a large pain for the person who's trying to communicate this issue. So there's like a cost benefit analysis of like, how easy would it be for me to, recreate this and show this to somebody? And if I do the simple version, like, is it just going to work because it's so easy and my problem's more complex? So I think you kind of got to weigh your options a little bit, and knowing the tools that are out there, like, I guess this JSON generator, I was going to say Faker, but that, then you got to like npm install Faker and figure out how to like generate your data structure. So it's, there's a lot of cost that goes into recreating issues like that.
Now, what if the project someone shares is like 5,000 files? There's so much stuff going on. There are really like 5 different apps within the app, like all like intercommunicating. And then they say like, oh yeah, when I go to this route, like, all you have to do is like download this. You have to set up like a few different databases. Make sure you install like a few dependencies. It takes you like half a day. And then you have to try to figure out like how all of this is working. Like,
that's where, as a maintainer,
have an application like that.
Yeah, that's where, as a maintainer, you have to rein yourself in and not lambast them for being hilarious. But I guess.
Well, what should they do instead?
Yeah, I mean, at that point, that's where it comes into the obfuscation aspect that I mentioned. I can't, if there is truly a situation, I haven't ever seen a situation that can't be like obfuscated by like fake data and something a little more accessible. But the onus is not on the maintainer to be able to correctly recreate the problem. The onus is definitely on the person with the issue to provide the easiest environment for somebody to see it occur. So, it's tough, but at that point, like if you're having somebody try to like download a table and like import it, and like, use like a whole MVC full stack application just to recreate a problem. You can try that, and maybe some maintainer is glorious enough to work with you in that environment. But I would definitely advise on working really hard to find a better obfuscation, maybe outside of your development. If we're going back to, if this was like an open source repository, if the discussion is like, it's open source, why can't I just share my repo? But if it's like an MVC application where you have to get all of these things perfect, even though it's open source and it's the repositories there, I would give that context, but I would also work to try to find like some kind of abstraction for replicating the issue a little more easily.
So would you say in creating a demo, they should try to make it as simple as possible, like as little code as possible, where the problem still occurs?
Yeah, the MVP where the code breaks.
The minimum viable problem.
The MVP, minimum viable bug.
Minimum viable demo. Anyway, interesting.
So I learned a lot about your experiences and coming to open source. I'd like to change topics soon, but before I do that, is there anything else that you'd like to share with new contributors to the Vue ecosystem or any other coding ecosystem?
I'd definitely say, you got to start with something that you have a genuine interest in. Something that's gonna, there's the curiosity light bulb is on, right? And that way it's a little bit more fun. Like, I guess there's the other avenue of like, I was doing something for my work, and so I needed something, and it's a nice way to give back, in that case. But, try and find something that really interests you. And the more you delve into it, I have not found a case yet where, you aren't surprised by, like, if you look at it from the big picture, you're saying, hey, I want to help you with this thing that you're building. It's kind of hard for people to be like, oh, that sounds terrible. No, I don't want your help. Like, that rarely happens. For the most part, we all hear stories of like war stories about how open source is, people are drowning in issues, and they're generally waving a white flag and they're saying, no, you can absolutely help me. Here's all the tools you need. So, you'll generally find that going out there, it's going to be a little bit, I think if you put yourself out there, you're almost going to be scared because you're going to get something like put on your plate that it's bigger than you expected. People are going to say, yes, go ahead, right here, dive in here. And you're going to be like, oh my goodness, I was just going to do some documentation stuff. So, go at your own pace as well. But yeah, I think that my biggest learning experience has been how welcoming open source is. And, I just haven't found a community that has I don't know, maybe things are changing these days, because I always hear about the old guard of programming that, would like shame noobs. And I just don't see that much anymore. Maybe I'm in all the good circles because I don't, use, was it Hacker News? But that's my...
We try to keep you pretty friendly, at least.
Yeah. And you guys are doing a great job of it.
I actually just talk crap behind your back, so that's the problem there.
Yeah. No, I've seen those communities, and they do exist, but I don't know. It seems like a lot of the newer technologies with open source communities, they tend to really frown on people being that way. And so, I don't see it as much either. And generally, at least the newer open source communities have all been very beginner friendly. And I think part of that too just comes out of the fact that a lot of these projects are to the point now where they're trying to gain adoption. And a lot of the people that are adopting these technologies are newer. We're seeing more new people come into the industry than we've ever seen before. And I don't think that's going to change or slow down anytime soon.
Yeah, in terms of like final statements on open source for anybody thinking about it, I mean, it gets summed up to just do it. Even if you think it's small, like the thing is, the moment you go to somebody about contributing, I know that as a maintainer myself of applications, I know that the reason that library maintainers, when I contribute, they help me a lot because it's an investment. They hope that you will continue contributing, just like that guy that offered Alex, core contributor status on Bootstrap Vue. The thing is, you got to start somewhere. So never think the issue is too small. Just do it.
Yeah, I'd say one more piece of advice that I'd give is a lot of people ask, like, what can I do to contribute? And that can be an okay question sometimes, but a question that I prefer is, would X be a useful way to contribute? Because people know what problems they have, but they don't know what problems you can help with. So if you give them a menu of things that you know you can do, that you feel comfortable with, like, I'd be happy to write tests, like if there's any test coverage missing, I'd be happy to write documentation. I'd be happy to, help, investigate some kind of problem if you need someone to do that. And if you ask a really specific question like that, they'll often come up with something right away that you can help with. But if you just ask more generally, like anything I can help with, it's like, oh gosh, we're going to have a whole conversation about this. Like, I don't even know what you can do.
Yeah, I think that specific topic, that is a responsibility of maintainers to use a label such as good first issue, because that is that exact menu you're discussing. I mean, it's very important to have like a platter of items for newcomers to be able to select over.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's room for both sides to help with that communication. All right. So the other thing that I was kind of curious to talk to both of you about today is that you've both written Vue applications and built Vue applications, and you've also built React applications. And to start with, I was wondering if you had any kind of advice for Vue developers who are maybe starting their first React application and aren't really sure like where to dive in, what to do, like what resources they should look at. I see Alex and Kyle pointing at each other. It looks like neither of them want to take it.
That's funny. I actually can't see his face. I'll go ahead and dive in then. Yeah. If you're making your first React application coming from Vue land, there are obviously many things that are similar between the two frameworks, and there are many things that are very different. In terms of preparing yourself, I personally, I'm like a huge fan of, I mentioned him earlier, Maximilian Schwarzmüller. He teaches Udemy courses on all the major front-end frameworks. I think the way he teaches the courses is just like perfect for diving in for the first time. So even though I had been coding for like, I guess if you count school, I had my computer science degree, so like 4 years and then like a year professionally, it's totally fine to still dive into like Udemy courses and like you can skip through what you already understand. So I definitely recommend diving in like on a tutorial. After that, understand the huge core differences. One aspect being, in terms of the three major frameworks, Angular, Vue, and React sides on the mentality of no opinionation. Angular sides on the aspect of full opinionation. They give you a very rigid framework. And Vue is somewhere straddling that line in the middle, I think, very well. So just understand that Vue's documentation provides direction in terms of how you should code something, provided their API. React will literally just give you the API, and the community is the one that decides typical best practices. That's the main takeaway that I've got between the two.
Yeah, I actually find it interesting that you said looking at a person going from Vue to React, because it could just be the ecosystem, like my local community. But I generally end up talking to developers who have been in React and are actually migrating to Vue. But yeah, there are definitely I think kind of on what Kyle was saying on that spectrum of opinionated. I think one of the things that is like when people talk about React, they generally say React and refer to what they are familiar with as the full application stack.
Yes.
Right. And React is the Vue, yes. Right. And so, React is, you add Redux and then, you say, okay, well, Redux maybe that's a little too much boilerplate. So we'll do some sort of special action creator thing. We add sagas. So there's like, nested levels of modules here that they're generally referring to as a whole. And so one thing that it's really important to kind of remember when you're translating back and forth is that while Vue doesn't really require you to use all of their tools in terms of state management and routing, they do have like canonical solutions for this with Vue Router and with Vuex. And so that's kind of nice. And really, they follow a lot of the same patterns in terms of application, architecture with like unidirectional data flow with state management and that sort of thing. What you really get into is kind of the differences in template languages, right? Like JSX versus Vue templates. And even there, like I'd kind of just go case by case, right? Because maybe one person's all, ready to do the Vue CLI and do single file components. But I see other people that are just dropping a script tag and they're doing, and then it's like, okay, well, make sure you're using the Vue build that includes the template compiler, right? So that you can use your string templates. And so there's a lot of different ways people can come at Vue or React and go from one to the other. So it kind of depends for me. I try to tailor, my advice. Sorry for the generic answer.
Yeah, no, the opinionation, as you mentioned, like it rides not just at the API, but also in the tooling. As you mentioned, like React doesn't have an official router, nor does it have an official state management system aside from its own context API. So Vue provides. I personally like. I like Vue's mentality of the opinionation aspect, even though I currently work with React. And there are things that I liked about React in terms of I actually prefer JSX to the single file component aspect nowadays. I didn't used to, but
although you can use JSX with Vue as well.
You can use JSX with Vue, and also there's a library called OneLoader. You can use the single file components within React. It has like a lot of Webpack obfuscation essentially. So yeah, in terms of the opinionation, it's not just in terms of like the API and they give you good ideas in the Vue documentation. It's also, they have an official router. They have an official state management library. Mm-hmm. And so that's a big difference as well.
Yeah, I recently was at a meetup and I was talking to some people who I think were coming from just different backgrounds. And so they weren't really doing web development. One guy was doing game development in maybe C# or something like that. And his wife, I can't remember what her background was, but they were both kind of like, all right, we want to, like, they might have had a web project that they wanted to work on. And I think I'd seen them maybe at another meetup. And so I think they were like sampling, like, oh, let me check out like Angular and Vue and React and all the different frameworks that I can get my hands on. And so, that was kind of an interesting thing to talk with them. And, one of the coolest things that I think that I was able to relay to them was that like Vue has a lot of really cool free tutorials. Like what's his name, Jeffrey Way from the Laravel community has a really awesome Vuecasts, I believe is what it's called. And I think that's actually what got me started with Vue in the first place, to the point where I was confident enough to pick it for a work application. So that was pretty fun, being able to pass along. And it's just because I haven't been in the React ecosystem as long. I'm I'd imagine with this popularity that there's just as much resources or more for people providing tutorials. But it's really cool when you're able to like say, hey, I learned it from scratch with this little free tool, and so can you.
So it sounds like if you're starting from React and going to Vue, or starting with Vue and going to React, you're not starting from scratch if you start on a project that's using a different framework. It sounds like a lot of the ideas still translate.
I certainly think that they do. And recently we've seen a lot of new patterns, kind of hit the blog post, route. And like you've got the render prop idea in React, which is a pretty cool pattern rather than doing wrapper components, and kind of allows for intermixing composition and passing, data down to, actually up from a parent into, from the child into the parent. And so like Vue has this idea of scope slots, which allows you to share data in that sort of way, and kind of like make custom templates, if you will, for the slot of that component. And so like I kind of try and help people, it's like if you're going from one to the other, if you're like, oh, I'm in React and I'm some people kind of like quote unquote subscribe to like this pattern or not, right? So I use a lot of render props. So I'm like, oh, well then you're going to really like Vue scope slots. And, if somebody's in Vue and they're like, I use a lot of Vue scope slots, and this is how you might do it in React. And there's a lot of ways to like translate those patterns, but, you take them as they come.
Yeah, I actually just went to a React rally, and there was a React developer that was mentioning like, well, I don't want to lose the paradigm of being able to do like render props. So that's why I like React like a lot more. And I was like, you can do them, just use scope slots. It's like the same exact thing. So
Or even if you're just using render functions for everything, you can literally just use render functions. You can use the exact same pattern. The advantage of scope slots is it allows you to use a mix of templates and render functions however you'd like. And the scope slots will work in both of those contexts.
Yeah,
Whereas
exactly.
if you're using if you're using render props, then you really are relying on like using render functions throughout your entire application.
Yeah, the paradigms, like the sort of the way you're passing data back and forth may actually be the same, but the paradigm feels entirely different if you're using a template versus a render function. And that's actually what I find really empowering when you learn both frameworks, and if you continue on to other frameworks. Like I went down and started digging deep into functional components in Vue. And so, I started learning a lot more about the way the virtual DOM API, the way that works with vnode data and that sort of thing. And just recently I've been playing in React and just using render functions with Node.js, and you get really stunned with how similar these APIs are. And it really helps you translate ideas. And I mean, I wouldn't necessarily recommend every person try that, but I mean, if you got the urge to dig deep, like this kind of stuff is really useful, and it can help you just sort of like bridge the gap from one framework to another.
Yeah, and in a lot of cases, especially with functional components, in some cases, like you could write a little script that would just convert all of your functional components in React to functional components in Vue, or vice versa.
Yeah, they're pretty translatable. I mean, like basically the attribute or the property object is a little bit different, but I think they're totally mappable.
So one thing that I'm wondering is, let's say that somebody on this call was going to be at, I don't know, some kind of summit where they were going to be able to meet with, the React core team. What kinds of things would you have them suggest to them that the Vue core team's doing well, and what kinds of things should they say, hey, I hear this is really great in React land. Can you tell me a little bit more about it?
Great question.
I personally would love if the computed properties was possible in React. I mean, the power of having this sort of cached computed value for your props it seems, maybe it's just because I started more with Vue and I learned how to really leverage that. But that would be something I would love to see in sort of the React component API.
Could you translate that to like a constructed state?
What exactly are you talking about? Like get derived state from props or something more like that?
You could do it that way with the lifecycle method, or I think you could use the constructor on the class and then derive like state from props, and it would act just like component did mount. You wouldn't see a visible re-render, but then you have a computed property. It's just in state instead of props.
Yeah, you because React doesn't have a reactivity system, you'd have to do a little bit more to tell it like when to recompute this computed property, just like you have to tell it like, should the component update?
Yeah, that's why I think the computed state property would probably be the best way to do that. However, the difference would be with reactivity, discussion in Vue can still happen both ways with computed properties, especially, and like things like emit and watcher in the event bus. So I think that would be the one limitation, is the data flow is still definitely one directional. So it can only come from the parents discussion.
And I will say, if you use mobx with React, you can actually get computed properties like with a reactivity system, because mobx offers essentially an identical reactivity system to what Vue is using. So if you're using React with mobx, you're basically like writing more verbose Vue components.
Yeah, but this is exactly like, this is really fun to talk about, because this is exactly what Alex was just talking about in terms of we were talking about like the tooling. It's like our responses have mostly been like, in terms of the opinionation, Vue gives like a clear way to have a reactive paradigm with the computed properties, and React, you can do it. There's just all these different ways that the community has decided, or you can really get into the API. And in terms of things that I'd recommend to them, is it okay to answer don't change anything? I think they're both kicking pure ass, and they're amazing communities to work in.
And I think there are advantages to being a little bit more focused with the core library. that React has and leaving more to userland, because there's a lot of innovation that comes out of that too. When there's a really good solution that already exists for a problem, sometimes the innovation can stagnate a little bit because people will be like, oh, I mean, it's not that big of a problem.
Yeah, I mean,
like, this is already like 90% as good as I want it to be. And so, there's not as much incentive to try something like dramatically new and different.
Definitely. And not even that, if it's like in terms of bouncing off the stagnation aspect, if there's an official solution, you're wondering if anybody's going to use an alternative solution or how difficult it's going to be able to maintain. So even if you know you want to do something different, you're going to probably err on the side of not doing so.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'd be kind of curious, with React coming out with a lot of time slicing and suspense features for the fiber rewrite, I'd be kind of curious how any of that maps to Vue, and if Vue has, back to like what you could, say from one team to another, right? Like, I wonder if there's anything there for Vue in terms of, all these different pieces of your application that might want to request asynchronous data. I don't know if, there's a lot of really cool stuff you can do with async components in Vue. So I don't know if that story is fully answered or if there's new, paradigms. Like, obviously we don't really have full access to this kind of stuff yet, or at least I don't in my React project. And so, I think the community probably has to pave the way a little bit and see what they can do with this, but I'd be kind of curious to see what Vue could learn from that time slicing and suspense.
Yeah, I'd love to see where they're going to go with async rendering. That was like a big hot topic at the conference I was just at, is all the different ways that time slicing and suspense is going to change not just React itself and how you use it, but also many libraries. For instance, Brian Florence just came out with a new a router, and it relies a lot upon like suspense as paradigms.
Yeah, and async components is something that's been possible with Vue for quite some time. The time slicing in like that beautiful demo. It's like one of my favorite demos that I'd seen in a while. That
Dan
is really
Abramov one, right? Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, Dan Abramov's, at in Iceland or something when he first gave it. But that was just fantastic. I felt really inspired, and that's definitely something we're paying attention to, and something that we're thinking about potentially delivering too. And I think the React team, is still also figuring out like how it's going to work. So we're both kind of keeping an eye on that problem and trying to figure out like how can we best provide that kind of development feature, where even on slow networks, your application essentially automatically throttles itself in a really smart way. That's absolutely fantastic. And we have some partial answers to that, and React has some partial answers to that already too. But we're both, I think, coming up with better solutions, and that's still in progress.
This is so interesting to me because I think when Vue first sort of like really came onto the scene, everyone, at least in my community, everyone sort of felt like, why do we need another framework? Like we've got Ember, we've got Angular, we've got React, like we've got solid choices.
I certainly felt that way.
Yeah, and yet like there was something about Vue that you're just like, well, this just feels so cohesive. It's guiding me along the path. Like it's got such a nice API. It's really performant. And I think it had an opportunity to learn a lot from every other framework. And now, it's established itself, and now we're into like, where the wall is in terms of progress, and people are just nudging it forward again, and everyone's on the front lines, everyone's learned from each other. And it's just like everyone has got a different view on something, and then they push it forward a little bit, and then they go, oh, how can we learn from that and adapt that, and will it work in our paradigm?
Yeah, I'm actually really grateful for the different frameworks that we have, because we are constantly learning from each other. You'll see a lot of the same ideas repeated between all the frameworks. And I feel like every time anyone comes out with like a new CLI tool, it's the best CLI tool that exists, because whenever we're creating something new, we're looking at the best practices that all these other communities have established and trying to combine them into something even better than before.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing with the, now there's GUIs that are coming with our CLI tools, which almost feels like it's a paradox or something like, but it's a CLI tool, but it has a GUI. It's amazing.
Well, and back to your point of there are good options out there already for frameworks. Why do I need another one? I mean, that's the other point is somebody else is eventually going to come along, I believe, and say, I like what's out there right now, but I really want something more like whatever. And then we wind up with the next best, I mean, that's what Vue was, right? It wasn't, the breakthroughs weren't in the way that the framework necessarily did anything different from Angular or React. We still have components and the big ideas, a lot of them are really the same. What it was just some people wanted that guided path, and there were some other things that it did differently that made things a little bit easier. And so there's, if we see another framework, it's going to be another incremental growth on top of what's already out there. I mean, I feel like in some ways React was a little bit of a leap forward, and in other ways it wasn't. But, from what was out there before it. But, generally you don't see major strides forward. Generally what you're seeing is, we need something, and this would make things a bit easier, and it'll save us, 10 hours a week per developer or something like that. And so people go and use it because it's more pleasant.
Yeah, even Vue's reactivity system, which a lot of people think of as like a stand-apart feature or a standout feature. It was based on a lot of other things that have been done before, and there was some innovation there in terms of like how we implemented it, so that you could just like write JavaScript and it was just reactive. But that was the only like big innovation. The other one, I guess, is just combining things. You talked about how Vue felt very cohesive when you were first using it, Alex. Like trying to put things together in a way that makes sense. The things that other people have done that they've worked really hard on and refined, and trying to refine it maybe a little bit more on top of that, and also fit it into a system where it doesn't feel like a big bag of just stuff. Because frameworks can feel like that too, where it's just like, okay, we have like 10,000 features and there are 10,000 different ways to write my app, and I don't even know which one I should use anymore.
In terms of like, I always I get a little disgruntled about like, why do we need another framework discussion? Because we just touched on the aspect earlier that like competition drives innovation. And I don't think anybody needs a reason. If you want to make a new front-end framework, go ahead. Because, what if it does do something so groundbreaking that everybody else has to keep up, and it changes the way we do everything? I mean, the last like 4 years of web development have been so vastly improved than it was before. So I love the idea that JavaScript is all about like, what's the new framework today? That's my favorite aspect of like the whole community. It's the trade-off though is, you just mentioned it. There's so many ways to do things. It's very, I'd say getting into web via JavaScript, it's tough for beginners. There is, not only are there opinions, but then there are like many communities that don't have opinions and tell you to choose your own. And when you don't have any idea of what to do, you just kind of want the answer given to you so you can learn. And it's just kind of straddling the line between there.
All right. Well, I need to push us to picks. But before we do, Kyle and Alex, how do people find you online?
I'm Kyle MH _ on Twitter. My Medium is also Kyle MH with no underscore. And my GitHub is Kyle MH with no underscore.
Yeah, I'm pretty much on everything as Alex Sasha Regan. And you can find me on Twitter and on GitHub. Honestly, those are really the only two things that I'm paying much attention to these days.
Awesome. All right. Well, let's go ahead and do some picks. Hi, this is Charles Max Wood, and I've been asked more times than I can count, how do I stay current? There's a lot to this question, and I'm working on a solution. Code badges. That's right. You heard me right. Basically, the idea is that you come and do a code badge, and that gets you an introduction to a topic. Then you can decide if you want to pursue it further. But while working on the badge, you gain enough proficiency to be able to pick it up again if you need. A lot of technology comes through on the bleeding edge, and not all of it sticks, but the principles do. So doing badges on the technologies that will get you ahead will provide you with experience needed to stay competitive. Plus, it offers social proof that you know something about the topic. The project is on Kickstarter right now. you can support it and get on the launch list at codebadge.org. Chris, do you have some picks lined up?
Sure, I can try to go. So one of my picks is going to be, I talked about like watching cooking shows on Netflix or other services sometimes to just have something in the background that, doesn't really distract you from programming, but still gives you some mild stimulation for the parts of the brain that you might not be using. And recently I've been getting into like home decorating shows, I guess. I don't have cable, so people who have HGTV, this is probably what they're doing all the time. But this is kind of new to me, and I'm enjoying shows like Amazing, I think it's called Amazing Interiors, and there's some others like Stay Here, where they, go and redo like Airbnbs and stuff like that. And those are kind of fun. I also just enjoy like seeing the weird stuff that people do with their spaces. And I find it sometimes kind of inspiring to see how people have decided to live and like what they've put into making their homes a place that feels like a home to them and makes them really happy. That also makes me feel like I'm living in just like some kind of dank hole. So there's that side of it too.
It's like the modern HGTV.
There you go.
And, well, I can't build out of a cave, but like maybe I could get a new rug.
Don't make yourself obstacles, man.
Yeah. All right, I'm going to jump in here with a few picks. So one pick that I have, I've been playing this game on my phone and been enjoying it. It's called Terra Genesis. And the thing that I like about it is partially just kind of the physics and science-ish stuff that's in it. The other thing is that it's kind of addictive, but at the same time, it forces me to wait for things to finish. So that's been nice because it forces me to put my phone down. And then I have a few other picks, but they're mostly things that I'm working on that I want to just shout out about. And these things will probably be at various stages of done by the time this show comes out. One is so the Get a Coder Job website. I think I mentioned that before. Getacoderjob.com. I also have been putting up the swag, so swag.devchat.tv. And then the last one is I have people ask me all the time how to stay current. And it's funny because I kind of walk people through the steps, figure out why you want to stay current, what you want to stay current on, and then, go look and see what people are talking about and what's coming up, and then decide, your best guess what it is that's going to pay off for you based on what you want. And then you can go and learn it. And then I talk about the process of learning things. Anyway, I've decided that I really want to put together a sort of, for lack of a better term, a way for people to keep track of their learning. And so I've devised this thing called codebadge.org. And so what it is it'll have different tracks in it, and you can go earn the badges. It'll all be free. So you can go and you can look at, an open source project. Let's put Webpack up for an example, or Babel. So you go and you learn how Babel works. And, you will go watch a couple of conference talks or a Pluralsight video or something. And okay, now I get Babel. And then there will be another one that's like set up a project using Babel. And so, then it goes from learner to you get the, builder badge or whatever we decide to call it. And then from there will also be like a contributor badge and a core team badge. And so, for Vue.js, for example, there will be a core team badge, and, people on the core team can award the badge to other people on the core team. And, we'll figure out how all that's supposed to work so that people aren't just getting badges that they don't deserve. But I think it'll be an interesting way of...
I'm okay if I get badges that I don't deserve.
I know, right? But I think it's an interesting way of just kind of having somebody be able to put their badges up and say, look, this is what I know, or this is what I've done. And then people can click through the badge and see what they've done to accomplish them. So if they have Git repos that fill the requirements, and people can go check out those Git repos. Or if they're a core team member, then it can go and show them their contributions to the Vue project or something. So anyway, just kind of a fun idea that I thought might be interesting for the community to contribute to. And people can add stuff to the tracks and things like that, but we need to figure out how all that works too. So anyway, that's kind of a guided tour of what to stay current on. And so if there are popular badges, say you're interested in JavaScript, you can pick a popular JavaScript badge and go after it.
So when is that coming out again?
I set up a Kickstarter. So if you go to codebadge.org, there should be a link to the Kickstarter. You can get on there. There's also a form you can fill in if you just want to get notified when we launch. So anyway, Kyle, what are your picks?
I just signed up on your form, by the way. My picks, we've talked about a little bit in the show. Thanks to the shout out, by the way, Operation Code. I'm the front end lead. Not very happy with the live repository, and I have a new repository coming in. So if you want to get involved with some React application open source, feel free to register on the website. You'll get an invite to our Slack team, which is awesome. And by the time this goes out, it'll be just the start of Hacktoberfest. So get yourself some swag by contributing with us. And shameless plug, we talked about React versus Vue on my Medium. I have yet another React versus Vue article. I try to update it based on how my opinions shift, but it's a pretty deep dive. I talk about the differences between like React being purely one-directional data flow, for instance, and Vue having escape hatches to be reactive. And my last pick would be Sarah Swedan. She's like the goddess of SVG, and it's been really cool being like the SVG guy in the office, and it's all thanks to her. She's awesome to follow on Twitter, and she has an amazing website and blog.
Awesome. Alex, do you have some picks?
Yes. So I recently invested in a standing desk, and I don't have the best posture sitting at a computer all day. So this was an awesome investment. I did a little research. I ended up going with Uplift, but I've heard really, really good things with Jarvis as well. So, I recently started a job where I work from home, so I needed a new desk. So if anyone else is in that situation, or if your company is going to buy you some furniture, that'd be pretty awesome. Definitely recommend standing desks.
For those that can't see, he's standing now.
Yes, I am. I also recently got a new computer. I've had the Linux bug to try something new. And System 76 is a company out of Denver. And they make their own hardware. I think currently they make their own desktops, and they're actually doing some sort of like reassembly for their laptops. But I bought an Oryx Pro, which is just screaming fast and has loads of memory, so you can run multiple Electron apps at one time. And so they're awesome, and they even have their own Linux distro called Pop OS, which is kind of an Ubuntu variant. And it's really easy to use. I like it a lot. And the last thing that I have is very self-serving, potentially self-serving. It's a little library I wrote. And so I like to dabble in other languages. And one of the ones it's like my unicorn language. Like I haven't figured it out yet, but I'm really interested, and it's Rust. There's just so many cool things going on in that language. And I was trying to, just get started. And I came across these two types that they have, which is the option and the result type. And I guess they're really, really grounded in functional programming. It's one of the things I don't feel is talked about as much with functional programming is like the maybe type. And it's basically because it gets into monads and it's kind of confusing, but it's really powerful and really cool. So I wrote, this is how much of a JavaScript to the core person. I can't escape it. In order to understand it, I rewrote it in JavaScript. I wrote options and results in JavaScript, in TypeScript to be specific. And so I have a library called safe-types, and it's just kind of an experiment to do errors as values and to eliminate null and undefined and do some cool stuff there. So I have a couple links, for the library and for kind of an explanation on how I do what I generally refer to as poor man's pattern matching in JavaScript and TypeScript.
All right. Sounds great. Well, thank you for coming and chatting with us.
My pleasure.
No problemo.
All right. Well, we will wrap this up, and we will catch everyone next week.
Bandwidth for this segment is provided by CacheFly, the world's fastest CDN. Deliver your content fast with CacheFly. Visit CacheFly.com.